I thought I'd show what you can do with the built-in scope on the Haltech Nexus VCUs. So I've got an R3 set up here at the moment using a bench simulator which I made, which simulates a Toyota 24+1 trigger. So I've just selected as a 3SGE. Yes, that's not the beams, that's the previous one. So with the built-in scope here, you can select you've got 4 channels. And you can select any channels that you want to see here with the VCUs. So if you're trying to look at crank and cam trigger stuff, then the most obvious things to look at would be trigger voltage and home voltage. And I've set them as 1 volt per division. And so you can see it's going up to a volt and down to -1 volt. On my simulator, I can change the scale there and make it half volt per division, half volt peak, or 2.5 volts peak. And you can see that shows on the screen there. So you can use that to set thresholds and things like that, although I'll show you later on why you might not want to do that. One of the other channels that you can look at is called engine angle, and this is a value that gets counted up in the ECU from 0 to 720 and then back to 0 again. So on this particular trigger, it's defined as the first tooth after the reset tooth happens at 10 degrees before top center. So this point here, which is where it goes back to 0, is just after that happens. So that's TDC there, which is cylinder 1 compression TDC. I've set this at a scale of 200 degrees per division, so that's 200, 400, 600, 720. Now, if you've got a triggering problem, then you're going to see jumps here in the engine angle. We've also set the trigger for the scope here to look at engine angle as the trigger, which means that the scope's going to try to center on this. But if the engine angle doesn't change, it'll still trigger the scope anyway. If you change that to normal, then it will only trigger the scope when it sees the engine angle change. I might show you what the trigger set actually looks like. So we zoom in on the actual trigger waveform here. I'm going to look at trigger input state. Now I'm going to bring up this as an example. Of course, sometimes you see people say things like, "My trigger's not working," and people say, "Well, adjust your thresholds." I'm going to show you what that actually means and how you can tell if you've got it. In this case, we have this is the trigger input state. So this is what the micro is actually referring to. And for a reluctant waveform, you want to have this negative edge happening as this goes down through 0, which you'll see it is. I'll draw this cursor, for example, see what's happening right there. Now the arming threshold is happening at a different point there, about 0.2 volt. And so whatever you set in your, if you're using an elite or you're doing manual thresholds, then you'll need to set that at a point where you get a nice clean waveform here, which means that you don't want it triggering when you don't have an input signal. You don't want it glitching on the edges. You don't want to be missing out any pulses. At the moment, I have actually set this as an automatic reluctant threshold, which you can do on the Nexus VCUs. So to show this in a bit more detail, I'm going to leave the trigger input state. We're bringing it all the way down to the bottom there. Put our trigger voltage here. And I'm going to also show our trigger arming voltage. There, so he's set at 0.3 volts per current. Maybe I'll zoom in a bit. So you can see where that one where the trigger voltage crosses the arming voltage is where we're getting an edge there. And there's another one here, which is the trigger peak voltage. That's up division scale there. Turn that one on. So what the ECU is doing here is it's looking at the peak voltage of the trigger and then using a fraction of that to make the arming voltage. So that way, as the trigger voltage increases, which I'll do here now, there you go, if I make it 2 volts instead of 1 volt, you can see the threshold moves up. 2 volts, it's higher again. Or 1 volt. So that, and that just means that it saves you the trouble of going through and changing the threshold voltages depending on your air gaps and things like that. It's also a bit more stable than doing it based on RPM, because if you have a trigger error, because your threshold is not set up correctly, then your RPM is probably going to be wrong as well. If you, as well as triggering off a particular channel, like say the engine angle, if you want this to all be stable, you can also trigger off in changing state. So if we look at something like trigger system error count, and we make that normal value change, then this screen is now completely still. It's not triggering at all. I can do a force trigger here and we'll do another trigger. Like that. But if I make an error happen here, then you'll see it's actually, so I made an error by getting rid of hot waveform there. So now that has actually triggered the scope here. So that's allowed me to see what's the actual waveform on the scope that happened when the error occurred. Maybe I'll actually change the input state here to be the error count. Then you should be able to see. Oh, it's at 11, that's interesting. Okay, how do I move all the way down to the bottom? Make that part coefficient there, and then apply. Make another gap like that. You'll see it was 11. Now the error's gone up to 12. And so that's triggered right in the middle of the waveform there, which is where the T is. So you can move the T back and forwards, and then that will trigger at that point as well. So if you're looking for an error in the trigger system, for example, and that would be a good channel to use. But you can also look at other things as well, like if you want to see your throttle response, you can trigger off your throttle position, and you'll get a really nice fast scope response there for when that's happening. You can look at the engine angle and look at your unfiltered manifold pressure, and you can see the bumps there as each cylinder does its intake stroke. You can also even look at things like your current here for your 25 amp outputs. If that's what's feeding your ignition coils, then you can see each coil doing its charging waveform. And we should actually be able to see. Also, if I go back to engine angle here. So you can see this is this is a configured as a distributor. Then so on ignition output 1, we have a pulse here every time we get around to generate that ignition. So you can see that there by looking at the output voltage, that pin. So you can also look at injector output voltages or whatever. So that's actually really, really useful diagnostic tool. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got to say. Thank you very much.